All right, it has hit 1 o'clock on the East Coast here, so we will go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, the latest in our Sage Talk series, Myths and Realities of U.S. Inequalities. My name is Jennifer Haldeman, and I am a product marketer with Sage, and I'm joined by my colleague Jeff Lasser, who is the publisher of our Sage Sociology list. But let me begin actually by introducing you to our speakers, Professors Mark Rank and Dawne Mouzon. Mark Rank is the Herbert S. Hadley Professor of Social Welfare in the School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, as well as professor in the Department of Sociology. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin, and he's widely recognized as one of the foremost experts in the country on issues of poverty, inequality, and social justice. His research on the life course risk of poverty has been groundbreaking, demonstrating for the first time that a majority of Americans will experience poverty at some point during their lives. To date, he has written many books and articles on a range of related subjects. One of those books is published by Sage, entitled Confronting Poverty, Economic Hardship in the U.S., which we will provide more information about at the end of our webinar. And then Dawne Mouzon is Associate Professor at the School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. She received her PhD in sociology and a master's in public health, also from Rutgers. Her research interests are health disparities, social inequality, race and ethnicity, aging, and families. And her published research has appeared in sociology and public health journals. She's also contributed 2 essays to our Sage text, Getting Real About Race, about ethno-racial health disparities and Black marriage patterns. Professor Muzan regularly teaches her departments 2 courses on the social determinants of health and health disparities. And so before we get started, I do want to let you know that this 1-hour webinar is being recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access any slides that are shown to all registrants in the coming weeks. And if you do have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right hand of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. And at the end of the webinar, we will have some time for question and answer from attendees. So please use that Q&A box along the way to ask any questions to our speakers throughout the webinar. And we'll do our best to get all of those questions answered, but if we're not able to get to all of them today, we will allow our speakers the opportunity to respond to those offline, and we'll include a link to their answers after the event as well. So without further ado, let me turn the mic first over to Professor Mark Rank.
All right. Well, thanks, Jen, for that introduction. And I would like to welcome everyone as well. It's great to be able to have a few minutes and talk with you about some of the research that both of us have been doing. Now, there certainly have been a number of myths surrounding the issues of poverty and inequality over the years. And what I think the pandemic has done is to cause us to begin to question some of those myths and stereotypes. And so with that in mind, I want to take 15 or 20 minutes and just focus on 3 specific myths and show what the realities actually are. So the first is the myth that poverty happens to somebody else, but not to myself, that poverty is an issue of them, not an issue of us. So that's the first one I want to talk about. The second myth is the myth that the cost of poverty is minimal, that poverty really only affects those who experience it and perhaps their neighborhoods. And the third myth that I want to talk about is that poverty is the result of individual failures, such as not working hard enough. And in each of these cases, I want to talk briefly about the research and evidence that confronts and challenges these myths. So let me start off with talking about some of my life course research that Jen referenced in the introduction that looks at the overall risk of poverty. And this line of work really began with a very simple question, and that is, what's the likelihood that an American at some point in their lives will encounter poverty? Now, as I said a minute ago, one of the myths surrounding poverty is that it happens only to a small group of Americans, and it certainly doesn't happen to me. And as I began thinking about this question a number of years ago, we knew actually very little about what that overall lifetime risk was. So there was information about how many people are poor in any given year, and we knew how long and how often people experience poverty, but we really knew very little about the long-term risk of poverty. And by using a longitudinal data set that many of you are probably familiar with called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, it's followed a nationally representative households each year from 1968 onward. My colleague Tom Herschel and myself have been able to shed some light on that question. And it turns out that the number of Americans who are touched by poverty during their lifetimes is actually quite high. So we've looked at this in a number of different ways, and the results are all pretty much the same. So for example, between the ages of 20 and 75, it turns out that nearly 60% of Americans will experience at least 1 year below the official poverty line, and 3/4 will experience either poverty or near poverty. We've also looked at the likelihood of poverty using a relative measure. That is, what percentage of Americans will find themselves at some point in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, as well as the bottom 10% of the income distribution. And what we found is that between the ages of 25 and 60, 62% of Americans will experience at least 1 year in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, and 42% will experience a year in the bottom 10%. If we focus on the use of a welfare or a safety net program, we also find very high percentages. So for example, in one analysis, what we did is we looked at the percentage of children who would find themselves in a household at some point that used the SNAP or the food stamp program. And the percentage of children who found themselves in such a household at some point was almost 50%, 49%. And if we look at poverty from the broader perspective of significant economic insecurity, we find an even higher rate of incidence than in these numbers. So in an earlier book of mine called Chasing the American Dream, we constructed a measure of economic insecurity that included whether you used a welfare program, whether you fell below 150% of the poverty line, or whether the head of household experienced unemployment at some point during the year. And when we used this measure, this broader measure, we found that 4 out of 5 Americans will experience at least 1 year of significant economic insecurity between the ages of 25 and 60, and half the population will experience 3 or more years of economic insecurity. And finally, in one other analysis, we found that this life course risk of poverty has actually been rising from the 1970s onward. So in other words, the chances of experiencing poverty at some point in your life has been rising, even though the annual rates of poverty have remained roughly the same. Now, the question that I'm often asked regarding these percentages is, why are they so high? And one of the reasons why they're so high is that during the course of a lifetime, any number of things can happen to people, many of which are unexpected and detrimental. So losing a job, a family splitting up, getting sick, experiencing a pandemic. And when these things happen, there's often little to protect families from falling into poverty. So more and more families, including middle-class families, are experiencing greater volatility and downward swings in their income as a result of greater instability in the labor market and the lack of benefits such as health and unemployment insurance. So jobs are no longer as stable as they once were. Retirement benefits are harder to get. Good medical coverage may be difficult to obtain. The safety net has been weakened over time, and so on. So rather than a risk that affects a few on the fringes of society, it turns out that poverty and the use of welfare are events that will actually strike the vast majority of American citizens. And this is a fundamentally different way of understanding the issue, and one that implies that we all have a direct self-interest in addressing the issue of poverty. Okay, a second myth that I've been interested in is that poverty as a whole does not represent a sizable cost to the United States. That, as I said before, it really only impacts those who experience poverty and perhaps their neighborhoods. Now, there have been a couple of research studies that looked at the question of the economic cost of poverty, but there was a need to do a more recent analysis. And so what I and a graduate student here at Washington University did was to focus on the question of estimating the annual cost of childhood poverty in the United States. And we used the latest research to estimate the cost of poverty in several different areas. So these included the effect that childhood poverty has on lowering future economic productivity, the effect of childhood poverty on increasing healthcare costs, and the effect of childhood poverty upon raising criminal justice costs. So we know that poverty in childhood results in less economic productivity when children become adults. It results in higher healthcare costs, and it raises the costs associated with increased crime and incarceration. And we were quite conservative in measuring these costs, and there were many other potential costs of poverty that we didn't include in the analysis just because we didn't have solid data. So the estimate here might be thought of as a lower bound in terms of the overall economic price of childhood poverty. Well, when we summed together these costs, the overall estimate was that in 2015, childhood poverty in the United States was costing the nation slightly over $1 trillion a year. To put this in perspective, that was approximately 28% of the entire federal budget in 2015. The other calculation that we made was a cost-benefit analysis of reducing poverty. And our estimate was that for every dollar we spend on reducing childhood poverty, we would save between $7 and $12 in the future by reducing the economic and social costs of poverty. And as a result, we argue that reducing childhood poverty is not only the morally right thing to do, but it's also the economically smart thing to do as well. The bottom line is that the price of childhood poverty is exceedingly high. By allowing poverty to exist at such levels, we wind up spending considerably more in many areas than if poverty were substantially reduced. So impoverishment breeds serious health problems, inadequately educated children, and higher rates of criminal activity. As a result, we pay more for health care, we produce less productive workers, and we divert needed resources into the building and maintaining of correctional facilities. In each of these cases, we're spending our money on the back end of the problem rather than on the front end, which is almost always a more expensive approach to take. The old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is certainly apropos. It's not a question of paying or not paying. Rather, it's a question of how we want to pay, which then affects the amount we end up spending. By underinvesting in a segment of the population, the economy loses some of its human potential. On the other hand, social policies that invest in education, health, and skill development are rewarded with a more dynamic and innovative workforce. This, in turn, helps to create greater economic growth and productivity for the society as a whole. So by making an investment up front to alleviate poverty, the evidence suggests that we'll be repaid many times over in the lower costs associated with a host of social problems, as well as a more robust economy. So that's the second myth that I wanted to talk about, that the cost of poverty is minimal. On the contrary, it's quite expensive. The last myth, the third myth that I want to talk about here revolves around the question of why people in the United States experience poverty. And the typical way that we've thought about poverty in the US is that it's the result of individual failings, such as not working hard enough or not having adequate skills and education. In contrast, what I show in the Confronting Poverty textbook is that American poverty is largely the result of a failure at the structural rather than the individual level. There simply are not enough viable opportunities for all Americans. And the most obvious example of this is the mismatch between the number of decent paying jobs versus the pool of labor in search for such jobs. So over the past 50 years, the US economy has been producing more and more low-wage jobs that are lacking in benefits. It's estimated that in the United States today, approximately 40% of all jobs are considered low-paying, that is less than $16 an hour. And of course, beyond these low-paying jobs, there are millions of Americans that are unemployed at any point in time, and millions more that are working part-time but want to be working full-time. So there's a mismatch between those in need of decent paying jobs and the availability of such jobs. Now, exacerbating that situation is the fact that the American social safety net is extremely weak, resulting in sizable numbers of families falling through its rather large holes. The U.S. has also failed to offer the kinds of universal coverage for childcare, medical coverage, or affordable housing that most other developed countries routinely provide. And the result of all this is an increasing number of families at risk of economic vulnerability and poverty. And here's the way that I like to illustrate this, is with the analogy of musical chairs. So what I say is, picture a game of musical chairs in which there are 10 players, but only 8 chairs available at any point in time. Those who are likely to lose out at this game will tend to have characteristics that put them at a disadvantage in terms of competing for the available chairs. So not as much agility, not as much speed, perhaps in a bad position when the music stops, and so on. However, given that the game is structured in a way such that 2 players are bound to lose, then these individual attributes only explain who in particular loses out, not why there are losers in the first place. And the critical mistake that's been made in the past is that we've equated the question of who loses out at the game with the question of why the game produces losers in the first place. They are, in fact, distinct and separate questions. So while characteristics such as deficiencies in skills or education or being in a single parent family help to explain who in the population is at a heightened risk of encountering poverty, the fact that poverty exists in the first place results not from these characteristics, but rather from a failure of the economic and political structures to provide enough decent opportunities and supports in society. By focusing solely upon individual characteristics such as education, we can shuffle individual people up or down in terms of their being more likely to land a job with good earnings, but we're still going to have somebody lose out if there aren't enough decent paying jobs to go around. In short, we're playing a large scale version of musical chairs in which there are many more players than there are chairs available. And I think the recognition of this dynamic represents a fundamental shift in thinking from our old ways of thinking. It helps to explain why the social policies of the past have largely been ineffective in reducing poverty. What we've done is we've focused our attention and our resources on either altering the incentives and disincentives for those who are playing the game, or in a very limited way, upgrading their skills and ability to compete in the game, while at the same time we've left the structure of the game untouched. Now, when the overall rates of poverty do go up or down, they do so primarily as a result of changes on the structural level that increase or decrease the number of available chairs. In particular, the performance of the economy has been historically important. Why? Because when the economy is expanding, more opportunities or chairs are available for the competing pool of labor and their families. The reverse occurs when the economy slows down and contracts. Consequently, during the 1930s or after the Great Recession of 2008, or during the recent pandemic when the economy was doing badly, poverty rates went up. While during periods of economic prosperity, such as the 1960s or the middle to later 1990s, the overall rates of poverty declined. Likewise, changes in various social supports in the social safety net will make a difference in how well families are able to avoid poverty or near poverty. When those supports were increased through the War on Poverty initiatives in the 1960s, poverty rates declined. Likewise, when Social Security benefits were expanded in the 1960s and 1970s, the elderly's poverty rates declined sharply. Conversely, when social supports have been weakened or eroded, as in the case of children's programs over the past 30 or 40 years, their rates of poverty have gone up. The other thing is that the recognition of poverty as a structural failing makes it quite clear why the United States has such high rates of poverty compared to other Western countries. These rates have nothing to do with Americans being less motivated or less skilled than those in other countries, but with the fact that our economy has been producing millions of low-wage jobs in the face of global competition, and that our social policies have done relatively little to support families compared to our European neighbors. From this perspective, then, one of the keys to addressing poverty is to increase the labor market opportunities and social supports available to American households. So to summarize, a shift in thinking about the causes of poverty from an individually based explanation to a structurally based explanation allows us to distinguish and make sense of two specific questions. First, why does poverty exist? And second, who is more likely to experience poverty? The musical chairs analogy handles both questions. Poverty exists primarily as a result of a shortage of viable economic opportunities and social supports for the entire population. Given this shortage, a certain percentage of the population is insured of experiencing poverty. Individuals with a heightened risk of being on the short end of this economic stick will be those who are least able to effectively compete for the limited number of decent economic opportunities. This includes those with fewer marketable skills, less education, ill health, single parents, and so on. This approach therefore recognizes the fundamental distinction between understanding who loses out at the game versus understanding how and why the game produces losers in the first place. So just to sum up, it looks like my time is up. In terms of the myths that I've been discussing, it turns out that poverty affects the vast majority of Americans at some point in their lives, that the cost of poverty to the country as a whole is extremely high, and that the reasons for poverty largely have to do with a failing at the structural rather than the individual level. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dawne, who will now talk about some of the myths surrounding the health of Black Americans.
Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. It's great talk. There are a lot of overlapping themes I think we'll see with mine as well. Hopefully everyone can see that okay.
Yep.
Okay,
perfect.
so great. Thank you, Jennifer. So thank you, Jeff, Jennifer, everyone at stage for inviting me here to talk today about debunking common myths about various race and ethnic groups. So it's one of my favorite things to do, to use data to do that. And in this brief talk, I will discuss 5 myths about Black American health. And I think it's really imperative to shine a light on common misunderstandings about health inequities, because faulty thinking often leads to victim blaming and ultimately bad public, economic, and health policy. So I won't cite all the scientific evidence here, but let's just take as a starting point that Black Americans consistently experience bad health, often worse than any other race or Hispanic origin group. For example, in terms of disparities in health outcomes, compared to whites, Black Americans experience higher rates of most chronic illnesses such as heart disease, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and asthma. Black people also have higher mortality rates and higher rates of premature death than white Americans. And in terms of healthcare disparities, Black people experience far less access to care and experience poorer quality healthcare once they are in the healthcare system. So the first myth I will discuss is the reasoning that socioeconomic status, not race, explains poor health outcomes among Black Americans. The link between socioeconomic status and health was first documented in the Whitehall studies, a set of longitudinal cohort studies following British civil servants beginning in the late 1960s, and data collection is still ongoing now. These studies found a sharp gradient in mortality and chronic illness risk, such that civil servants in professional and supervisory roles experienced the lowest mortality rates, while civil servants in more menial occupations experienced the highest mortality rates. These findings are why the Whitehall studies are credited with uncovering what is now known as the social gradient in health. a term that refers to the finding that as socioeconomic status increases, health status improves. In other words, best health can be found among people with the highest socioeconomic status. So this should be no surprise to this group here. But how does the social gradient in health factor into research on racial and ethnic health disparities? Well, not surprisingly, many of us know race is highly correlated with SES, such that Black Americans compared to white Americans are less likely to hold a bachelor's degree, more likely to live below the poverty line, have lower household incomes, have less household wealth, and so on. So the rationale behind this myth, and it's a reasonable one, I should add, is that the only reason that Black people have worse physical health than white people is because Black people have lower socioeconomic status. And we know that is tied to poor health outcomes. So if this reasoning holds water, then after we statistically control for race, Black-white health inequities should disappear. But is that true? So I'd like to show you some evidence for that. So let's take infant mortality rates as a case example. And here we'll just focus on white-Black differences. So as you can see, non-Hispanic whites experience an infant mortality rate of 4.6 infant deaths per 1,000 live births, while non-Hispanic Blacks experience more than twice that rate at 10.8 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. And many would explain away this disparity by citing the very real evidence that Black women have lower SES than white women. So let's compare Black and white women at each level of SES and see if that reasoning is true. So here we're going to be specifically testing whether Black women's lower educational attainment can explain their higher rates of infant mortality. So here again are Black-white differences in infant mortality rates, but this time controlling for educational attainment. So you can see educational level across the x-axis, 8th grade or less, all the way up to doctorate and professional degree. And the infant mortality rate for Black women is shown in the dark purple line, while the infant mortality rate for white women is in this light peach line. You can see that Black women have higher infant mortality rates at each level of education. The gap starts out pretty small at the lowest educational levels, but by high school, these differences start to become very substantial. Now, remember, if Black-white disparities in infant mortality rates are only because Black women have less education than white women, once you control for education as we have done here, any Black-white differences should be eliminated. The lines should be very similar, almost overlapping. But what we see is the opposite, especially at higher levels of education. At the bachelor's degree level, Black women experience roughly 7 more infant deaths per 1,000 than their similarly college-educated white women counterparts. That gap jumps to 13 additional infant deaths at the master's degree level and 25 additional infant deaths at the doctorate or professional degree level. The language that most medical sociologists use for this pattern is diminishing returns. We see clear evidence here of the social gradient in health for white women, for whom higher SES means fewer infant deaths. But for Black women, higher SES does not mean better health outcomes. In this case, higher SES for Black women actually means more infant deaths. So these data provide a clear answer to the myth that Black-white health inequities can be reduced to lower socioeconomic status among Black people. For infant mortality and many other health outcomes, health disparities persist and sometimes even grow after you control for educational attainment. So that means socioeconomic status cannot be the cause of Black-white health inequities. The second myth I would like to cover is the myth that racism mainly harms mental health, not physical health. A threat can be thought of as any challenge in the environment that an individual perceives they lack the resources to effectively respond to. So the idea behind this myth is grounded in various sociological and social psychological theories of identity that suggest that a stressor such as racism is a psychological threat to the self, especially for those for whom their racial identity is very salient to their overall self-concept. But those who primarily think of racism as a risk factor for poor mental health, but not poor physical health, overlook the fact that there is a documented physiology to the stress response. When individuals perceive a threat, the human body in all of its evolutionary beauty launches a physiological stress response that either allows the individual to actively confront or fight the stressor, or if they feel that they lack the resources to effectively confront the stressor, the fight or flight response would allow the individual to flee from the stressor, which is the flight response. And on the right hand of the slide, you can see some of the biochemical processes that are initiated when the stress response is activated. Now, the stress response is adaptive in the short term when there is an acute stressor because it mobilizes the body under threat, and then it turns off when the threat is gone. But what happens when the threat never goes away, or when there are repeated threats, such as when one lives in poverty or regularly experiences discrimination? When the stress response is chronically activated, those stress hormones continue to circulate through the body, which over the long term contributes to accelerated aging, also known as weathering, among Black and other marginalized groups. So yes, racism is a threat to the self and can therefore lead to mental health problems. But because racism is a threat, being exposed to it or even just anticipating it can lead to chronic activation of the stress response, leading to accelerated aging and by extension, premature death. This process relates to a concept known as embodiment in the public health literature, or the process by which the social environment, quote, gets under the skin. So while racism is certainly a psychological threat, it also impacts physical health by chronically activating the stress response. Despite consistent findings of poor physical health among Black Americans, the opposite patterns are found for mental health. And this relates to myth number 3, which is Black people have more mental health problems than whites. So this is an anomaly that many of us refer to as the Black-white paradox in mental health. For example, epidemiological data from the National Comorbidity Survey and the National Survey of American Life find that Black people have consistently lower rates than whites for just about every single major psychiatric disorder. And this finding has been consistently replicated over time by gender across different diagnostic disorders and across the life course. And this trend is not what we would expect, based first on Black people's poor physical health, because we know that poor physical health should be correlated with poor mental health. We would also not expect this finding because it runs counter to the well-documented social gradient in health, which finds worse health among people with lower SES. And finally, the Black-white paradox in mental health is also unexpected given Black people's greater exposure to psychosocial stressors, such as racism and residential segregation. Despite the general finding that Black people have better mental health than white people, inequality still remains in this area. For example, although Black people have lower lifetime risk of psychiatric disorders, among those who are diagnosed, they are more likely than whites to have persistent disorder trajectories, meaning disorders that last at least 2 years. And this finding could be explained by the lower likelihood of Black people to both seek and receive mental health care services, which is another way in which they face inequality in the mental health care system. When Black people do seek care, they are less likely than whites to receive a psychiatric diagnosis, even when they manifest the same symptoms. So even in experimental studies where they match patients based on symptoms, Black people are still less likely to receive a psychiatric diagnosis, or even worse, they are more likely to be improperly diagnosed, specifically with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. Black people are also less likely than whites to receive prescription medication for mental health problems and are less likely to be referred to psychotherapy. So these findings highlight the importance of studying Black mental health, despite the consistent finding that Black people have lower rates of psychiatric disorder than whites. The Black-white paradox in mental health remains an unsolved mystery, but an empirical fact nonetheless. Both I and plenty of other researchers have tested various causal mechanisms to explain this pattern, such as higher levels of religious involvement among Black people, higher quality family relationships, perhaps better coping strategies, even reporting or diagnostic bias. Yet to date, the puzzle remains unsolved and the trends persist. Black people, regardless of ethnicity, whether or not they are US born or foreign born, are far less likely to meet the criteria for most major psychiatric disorders relative to whites. The fourth myth is that the Tuskegee syphilis study drives medical distrust among Black Americans. And we hear this a lot in the media these days because this explanation is often invoked to explain COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy among Black Americans. It is important to note, however, that this gap in vaccine hesitancy is shrinking. Currently, more than half, or 61% of Black Americans are willing to or have already been vaccinated, compared to 69% of whites. Just as background, in 1932, the government sponsored a study of 600 Black Tuskegee Airmen, 399 of whom had syphilis but did not know it. The investigators were interested in documenting the natural course of syphilis, so they knowingly withheld treatment from those Black men with syphilis, even though at the time penicillin was known to be an effective cure. This is one of many historical instances of medical abuse inflicted on Black Americans, and many people use it to explain things like COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy among Black Americans. Yet current studies debunk the myth that Black people are preoccupied with Tuskegee and distrust the healthcare system primarily because of it. For example, ongoing work by Karen Lincoln of USC finds that the older adults that she interviews in LA, those who would be most familiar with the history of Tuskegee, more often cite contemporary medical racism as the cause of vaccine hesitancy, not Tuskegee. There are plenty of other current news stories, NBC, CNN, interviewing Black people who say the same thing, either that their distrust is due to their own personal experiences within the healthcare system, or concerns about side effects and or distrust of the previous presidential administration. And these reasons seem to matter more than Tuskegee for Black Americans. So by focusing on historical medical abuses such as Tuskegee, it overlooks the very real contemporary data showing that Black people are mistreated in the healthcare system very often. For example, the 2003 Institute of Medicine's landmark study, Unequal Care, uncovered evidence of rampant healthcare disparities between Black and white patients, even after controlling for a host of factors such as health insurance coverage and socioeconomic status. This report and plenty of related studies found that even in universal access systems like Medicare or the VA, where cost should not be an issue, Black patients were more likely to have poor cardiac outcomes and more likely to suffer amputation of limbs due to diabetes, even when controlling for severity of disease. There's also a lot of recent attention on perhaps one of the biggest healthcare disparities that exist, and that is in maternal and child healthcare. Black women are almost 4 times as likely to die during or after childbirth, largely in part due to the bias of healthcare providers, which research shows they are more likely to dismiss or overlook Black women's reports of pain and complications. So a focus on Tuskegee really does detract attention from where it should be, which is on addressing the unequal care that is presently given to Black Americans in the healthcare system. And the fifth and final myth I would like to discuss today is the myth that Black people have poor health because they make poor choices and or don't value having good health. And this myth reflects the tension between individual and structural determinants of health. People who believe in this myth would argue everyone has an equal opportunity to be healthy, and therefore health disparities are due to poor choices at the individual level. So if you look at the figure on this slide, you can see health at the bottom. And in the first set of concentric circles, you can see some individual level determinants of health, such as medical care and individual health behavior. People who believe in this myth focus on these individual level determinants of health. They just don't trust doctors. They don't exercise. They don't eat well. They don't value your health. If only they would just make better choices. But a person with a more critical eye would understand that whether or not people go to the doctor or, quote, make better choices is largely shaped by the next concentric circle, living and working conditions in homes and communities. So let's talk about individual behaviors such as healthy eating. If a person lives in a food desert where there are no full-scale supermarkets where they can buy affordable, fresh produce, it will be much harder for them to make healthy food choices. Past research confirms over and over again that grocery stores with fresh produce are scarce in marginalized neighborhoods. So again, healthcare and individual behaviors are shaped in large part by living and working conditions in homes and communities. We cannot just blame the individual. And finally, those living and working conditions in homes and communities are themselves shaped by economic and social opportunities and resources. For example, public policy or lack thereof determines patterns of racial residential segregation, which shape individual determinants of health, such as healthcare utilization and individual health behaviors. So in general, health equity approaches look beyond individual determinants of health and recognize that seemingly individual determinants of health often involve what are called constrained choices. A person with no affordable produce in their neighborhood, or a person who lives in a neighborhood where there's a lot of crime or no sidewalks, they do not have the full range of healthy choices available to them. Their choices are constrained, and they often have to select from a set of unfavorable options. So reducing the documented reality of constrained choices to some simplistic racialized belief about how Black people are morally inferior or naive or don't make good choices detracts from the reality of systemic racism that keeps Black people and other disadvantaged groups locked in a system of constrained choices. So I'm at the end of my time, so I won't be able to cover the vast literature on environmental racism, but I'll just want to choose one illustrative example to help make my point. This is a map of Los Angeles County. The areas in red and orange represent those areas of LA County that have the highest concentration of people of color. So between 80 to 100 or 60 to 80% of the population. And at the other end of the spectrum are those neighborhoods shaded in yellow, largely white communities. And finally, the green dots represent the locations of toxic release facilities. As you can see, toxic release facilities are highly concentrated in the red and orange areas, the areas with the largest populations of color. I mean, even if you look out here, it's very non-random. While there are almost no green dots in the predominantly white communities shaded in yellow. Again, that's just not a random phenomenon. So when we talk about health inequities being a function of disadvantaged people making, quote, poor choices, we need to talk about the disproportionately high rates of asthma among children of color. And think about, what should we be telling them? To just breathe better in these areas? So we really need to be more critical in our approach by zooming out and examining health metrics and health behaviors within the context of constrained choices if we really hope to affect change for the communities most in need of our intervention. And I think I'll end there.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of you for those really informative talks. We do have some questions. So we have a few already in the question and answer box. But anybody else, if you have questions, we have about 19 minutes to pose those to our speakers. So keep those coming. The first one here would be over to you, Mark. How do we explain the enormous amount of poverty to Americans who view any government intervention in increasing the safety net as socialism?
Well, I would say that is not necessarily socialism, but I think we need to think about, as I mentioned in my comments, we need to think about poverty as an issue that really affects us all in one way or another. And so by investing in a strong safety net, we're not just helping folks who need to use that safety net, but we're helping everyone in the society become more economically productive and so on. So, there is a lot of, there certainly is a lot of pushback. In an earlier book, I talked about a lot the idea of that America is steeped in the idea of rugged individualism, that you do it on your own, you're self-reliant. And certainly that's an uphill battle. But I think that we're entering a time period where there's a kind of a window of opportunity here, where we're thinking about bigger ideas and more progressive ideas in terms of kind of what Dawne is talking about, and what I was talking about, getting at some of these structural problems and structural issues. So I think I've been pleasantly surprised with the Biden administration and what they've been proposing. So we'll see, but I'm sure that President Biden certainly won't call his policies socialism.
Right, that actually goes into the next question about how you think the administration's plan for expanding child tax credits would affect child poverty.
Well, there's been a couple analysis on that, and it's estimated that so what President Biden has introduced in his pandemic relief package is to provide most households with children with $300 or $400 a month as a sort of a way to help raise those children. And the estimate is that could cut childhood poverty by 40 to 50%, which is pretty significant. And that's, the idea of doing that is pretty radical for the United States. European countries have had child allowances for long periods of time, but for the United States, this is a pretty radical idea, and it's a subset of the idea of a universal basic income, which people have been talking about. This is sort of a smaller part of that overall kind of idea. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think once people get used to this, this is only for the next year, but I think once people get used to it, it's going to be hard to take that away. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. And for one here for Dawne, one of the things that came up in your talk was lack of culturally competent and culturally humble care in the medical profession. Do you know medical schools or dental schools, if they're trying to do better, how are they taking responsibility or not?
That's a great question. And I actually used to work in a medical school in between degrees. And it appears as though, I mean, everyone's talking about these things now. I know in the medical school I worked in, there were a lot of efforts at improving the curriculum for medical students. And I know that they've now sort of changed the requirements for, I believe, medical school examination, or sorry, admissions tests that required people to know some level of social science. So I think everyone's trying harder, but I think, of course, in medical school and residency programs, there's such limited space for this type of curriculum. Sometimes this stuff gets reduced to grand rounds once or twice a year. So I think everyone's trying, but there's a long way to go.
And this one is also for you, Dawne. When controlling for SES, when measuring the link between race and health, notice that educational attainment was used. Was SES also measured using income, employment, wealth, occupational prestige? If so, what are the findings? Also, why was infant mortality used? What were the findings when looking at overall life expectancy, controlling for race and SES?
Well, that is a laundry list of metrics I wish we had. So definitely these findings have been replicated using wealth. We don't always have sort of longitudinal data on racial gaps in wealth. I mean, we're starting to get it more now, but we haven't had that. Actually, there are studies through Duke. In fact, I cited one of them, and that's actually the data I cited. It's from that Duke study that does look at wealth also. I just use educational attainment. Occupational prestige doesn't seem to be used as often in the US as it is in the UK. And so we have a lot of historical data on infant mortality. We don't have overall life expectancy by SES, just by race. So it's hard to get race, SES, and the health outcomes sort of all together in the same data.
Okay. And for Mark, how can we convince students that people who are impoverished are not totally responsible for their poverty?
Well, I think that's where, and Jeff would relate to this, I think that's where sociology comes into play. That sociology is the idea that, you know, we're not just, our behavior is not just sort of motivated from within, that there are many things that affect our behavior, and that's what we're focusing on. And so, you know, the example Dawne gave of food deserts is a great one that shows that, you know, the options available to people where they live may be more constrained or more open, and that has, you know, that goes beyond the individual. So I think, you know, just you know, sociology as a discipline is really, you know, is focused on this idea of really understanding the person within the wider environment, the wider economic, social, and political environment. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, and for Dawne, how do you measure racism and do you control for other threats?
Racism is most commonly measured using two different scales, both developed by David Williams at Harvard. One is the Everyday Discrimination Scale, which is a 10-item scale that looks at basically microaggressions that affect, and it covers realms such as, you know, receiving less courtesy in stores, being followed around, you know, someone insulted you, those sorts of things. So that's the Everyday Discrimination Scale that captures sort of racial microaggressions. And then there's another, there's a Lifetime Major Discrimination Scale that looks at acute you know, acute events that happen across the life course. So have you ever been denied a bank loan? Have you ever been, you know, had a police interaction, those sorts of things. So really, though, you know, regardless of which measure of racism is used, I mean, like, it's the same results. It's very robust association. The same results are always found. And of course, these studies control for a whole host of, you know, socio-demographic factors and things like that.
And for Dawne, what do we know about how a person's health and longevity is affected by frequent interactions with the criminal justice system?
We're learning a lot about that. Of course, you know, what really the research is focusing right now is on the threat of having contact with police officers. So there's been a lot of research that sort of documents the health effects of having been incarcerated, even the health effects, the spillover effects for people whose families, families who have people who have been incarcerated. And now there's research sort of at the neighborhood level, looking at heightened vigilance. So, the fear that, you're going to come into interaction with police, and then sort of ecological measures of, police activity and police stops in the neighborhood. And so I think a lot of research right now is looking at that and is finding that, especially for young Black and Latino men, is that they have higher anxiety symptoms, more depressive symptoms, and they often show signs of trauma, even if they haven't been stopped. Is even just being afraid of being stopped or having seen someone be stopped. So that's kind of what we know. We know a lot about the mental health consequences of direct contact with the police and also vicarious contact with the police.
Okay, and Mark, there was a question around the fact that, a lot of the STEM graduate programs have a lot of foreign students. We have high-tech industries that employ a large number of H-1B workers, and Americans still don't tend to gravitate towards STEM education. Do you think that individuals are partly responsible for missing those opportunities of high-paying jobs?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about that. Dawne, do you have any ideas on that?
I don't. I don't stop myself.
Jen, ask me another question.
Yeah, well, there was also a similar question just about, $15 or $20 an hour jobs right now that are still open. Some people speculate it might be because they're getting the $600 a week in unemployment. Yeah. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, and that's kind of the pushback against the idea of a universal basic income. But interestingly, there are some study results that just came out that looked at Stockton, California, and they did a pilot program on a universal basic income, and they provided folks with a certain amount on a monthly basis. And what they found, interestingly, was that the people that were getting the universal basic income actually had higher rates of employment than the people who were not getting it. And so that kind of goes counter to the idea that, well, if I'm getting this $600, I'm not going to try as hard, in terms of finding a job. I think what it does, what the research shows is that what that money does is it really improves people's standard of living and their conditions that they're living in, and actually may make them, in a way, be able to find a job that's very appropriate for what they're looking for. So it's interesting that study has showed that. There also is now research coming out of Finland. They've been doing a pilot program for a few years on a universal basic income as well. So anyway, that kind of puts a different spin, I think, on it. But that is a concern that, if you provide people with income, maybe they're not going to be as assertive in their job searching as they might be.
There was also a question, can sociologists use C. Wright Mills's sociological imagination to fight the negative stereotype of socialism in America?
Well, I think in my Confronting Poverty textbook, I have a couple quotes from C. Wright Mills, because his whole idea of we need to understand what's known as the sociological imagination, and that's really understanding the person's situation within, as we talked about, the larger environment, and that's not socialism, that's social science. That's understanding the reality of the situation. And people can put whatever label they want on that, but to me, that's just reality. Margaret Thatcher was famous for saying, there is no such thing as society. Well, I beg to differ. There certainly is something known as society, even though it's not, it's not quite as visible as some of these individual things that we see. So anyway, that's enough of my rambling.
And then we have a sizable one here for Dawne. When exploring the unsolved mystery of lower rates of mental health disorders among Black Americans, might the construct of resilience be a key factor? That is, can psychological and emotional resilience due to inequality and discrimination serve as a protective factor? Should this be measured at the group or individual level of analysis, and can it be disentangled statistically?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually sort of where my research is moving in that direction. It's so hard to get at it because we're still trying to define what resilience is and what it looks like. And the idea is, and it's sort of been studied in animal research, where this idea of sort of repeated exposure to stressors leads to stress habituation, which means they are less likely to respond to distress. So they just get used to stressors, essentially. And there's some like suggestive evidence that's come out recently that Black Americans who are exposed to repeated discrimination early on in the life course go on to develop lower rates of disorders than those who were not exposed to those sorts of challenges. So there's definitely suggestive evidence for it. And actually, I just wrote a pilot grant at my university to try to study resilience and coping mechanisms to determine if that's a way that we can explain the Black-white mental health paradox. So that's exactly where I'm heading, and I hope I find something.
Great. And Mark, of these myths, what are the most persistent misconceptions that students continue to have about inequality?
I think it comes down to this idea that, inequality is the result of individual failing, or poverty is the result of individual failing. That people just, if only they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they can do fine. And that's why, I think using an analogy like the analogy of musical chairs is very, very powerful, because people can say, oh yeah, I see how, we focus on who loses out at the game, but we need to step back and say the game is set up so that there's going to be losers in the first place. That's a very powerful idea that I think a lot of people can relate to. And when I use that, people go, oh yeah, I kind of see how that, and that's kind of that sociological imagination of shifting from the individual to a more kind of social framework and understanding a problem.
And how about you, Dawne? What do you think is the most consistent student misconception coming into your courses?
It's actually the same exact thing, which is, people just, they're unhealthy because they just choose to make bad decisions. And, so this is why that specific myth speaks strongly to me. Because of course, if you reduce it to individuals, then there's no role for policy or anything to intervene, and no one's to blame except the individual. So that's one of my pet peeves, that one, and I work a lot to try to debunk that for my students.
Okay, and one last one here for Mark. How can we reimagine the musical chair to make everyone winners?
All right. Well, you need to read my textbook with Sage, Confronting Poverty. No, I think that, like just take the idea of jobs, and we can do things to make jobs pay more of a livable wage. So, there we go. So yeah, I think we definitely can bring more chairs into that analogy so that fewer and fewer people are losing out. And there's lots of policy ideas that are being talked about today to do that.
It's a wonderful segue into our final slide here. Just I want to thank everybody so much, for both Mark and Dawne for their great presentations, all of you for joining us. On this slide here, you can see the covers of Mark's book, Confronting Poverty, which published just in January, and then Dawne is a contributor of two of the writings in the Getting Real About Race text, which will have a new edition in November. And she's also the upcoming author of Health and Inequality, the Social Origins of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities, which we'll be publishing with SAGE. But again, we would like to thank all of you for participating. A recording of this will be sent out to you. And if you have any further questions, I think we would be happy to answer those offline as well. So look out for an email from SAGE, and we hope to see you on another SAGE Talks in the future. Have a good afternoon.